Good evening, gentlemen. Better late than never. 8:11 p.m. right on the nose.
Sorry.
We have been studying the compiler's foreword of the Tanya. We finished studying it last week. The takeaway from the Alter Rebbe's compiler's foreword, from the introduction the Alter Rebbe himself writes to the Tanya, the takeaway is that this is a book that we enter, that it's not a book. That really the entire idea of the Tanya's writing is that the Tanya is not a book. The Tanya is the Alter Rebbe written down and given over. The Tanya is an encounter with the Alter Rebbe. We come to the Alter Rebbe with our problems. We come asking him how we can have love and fear of God, how we can have a connection to Hashem. And the Alter Rebbe's answer is the Tanya. And the answer is given in a way, to a certain extent, of take it or leave it. It's given in a way of, this is the reality, the Alter Rebbe is trying to help you, the Alter Rebbe is trying to show you the truth, and if we want this truth to work for us, if we're ready, we should say, maybe not even if we want, if we're ready for this truth to work for us, then we must be ready to trust the Alter Rebbe. If we're ready for this to work for us, everything has to be based on trust. The entire situation, the entire relationship with the Rebbe, with the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, is a relationship of trust. We are assuming that the Alter Rebbe knows how to bring the light of Torah, the light of our part of Torah, in other words, the infinite truth of Torah that we need to hear, to us. And on this, the entire Tanya is predicated. So we're going to begin chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Tanya starts off with a bang. It's a very famous beginning to a sefer. It's very well known. Many people have studied it. It's easier to give up later. Most people make it through at least chapter 1, speaking from personal experience. The first chapter of Tanya opens us up to inner realities. There's more superficial realities. There's the world as it can be judged, looking at it from the outside, looking at it from what might be called, although I'm not really attached to these words per se, from what might be called a more objective point of view, a more superficial point of view. The Alter Rebbe, from the beginning of chapter 1, immediately begins to, and the truth is this already started in the introduction, the Alter Rebbe is going to draw us even further into Pnimius. Pnimius is a fundamental word of Chabad Chassidus. It is a central word to the Alter Rebbe's whole outlook on reality. The way of the Alter Rebbe, the way of the Tanya. The way of the Tanya revolves around Pnimius. Pnimius means inwardness, the inner rather than the outer. Inwardness rather than externality or superficiality. Pnimius means the inwardness. The Alter Rebbe Chassidus is, in the way of the Alter Rebbe, particularly in the way of the Alter Rebbe, which we may touch on more at a later time, Chassidus is the inner reality of God meets the inner reality of Torah, which meets the inner reality of the Jew. Each of these three things has a superficial reality, has a way of looking at it from the outside, as it were, superficially. And each, God, Torah, and the Jew, have an inner way of looking at them. And as we're going to see, it's not just an inner way of looking at them, but even what we do with that information is going to all revolve around the idea of Pnimius, the idea of inwardness. Another way of translating pnimius, maybe, or just a term to think about on this theme as we continue forth into chapter 1, is authenticity. The Alter Rebbe is obsessed with truth and authenticity. One way of defining truth in Chassidus is consistency. Truth is consistency, the famous teaching, Aleph Mem Taf, Emes, the first, the middle, and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, what does it mean for something to be true? It means it runs from the top to the bottom, from beginning to end, and it's consistent, right? That's really what it means for something to be true. If it's really true, then it's always true, right? It's like, think of all the context where 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true, right? It's true in all of these different contexts and all of these different ways. That shows you how true it is. The Alter Rebbe is extremely and deeply interested in truth and authenticity, and pnimius and emes go together. The inner reality and the truth go together, and there's an obvious reason for this and some more subtle ones that we'll hopefully pick up through our learning. The obvious reason is that which is superficial obviously is not the same at every level by definition, whereas that which is inner is the true reality of the thing. Although, of course, the question that always has to be answered is, if the pnimius is so true, why isn't it also true on the outside? Why do we have to go digging for it if it's really true? And with this question, this is the question that launched 1,000 Maimarim, not in these words. 1,000 Hasidic discourses center around this question, the question of, if it's true, if it's really so true, then why don't we see it? Or why, that's even a more, that itself is a non-pnimius way of asking the question. It's a superficial way of asking the question. The deeper way of asking the question maybe is that if the entire focus on God's reality is the inner reality, why does an external reality even exist? Or what are we to make of the fact that the inner is in contrast to, is in conversation with, you might say, the outer, or the external? It's very important to have this preface and sort of, the truth is I could say this about 1,000 things and we'd never get to chapter 1 because there's so much, and it's very much like studying the Gemara, where the Gemara doesn't have a beginning. There is no place to really go in. It's like biting an apple, right? Where's the place to bite it from? You have to just pick somewhere and bite, right? There's no right way to start that you've had all of the preparation. There really is no such thing. This goes back to all our previous classes about why we can't really learn Tanya. Tanya is very difficult, etc., etc., and the trepidation of teaching this class. So ideally, we would have 1,000 classes all about different ideas, and we could have all of those ideas swirling around as we even read the first idea, the first words of Tanya. That would be my preference. Unfortunately, this is not possible, right? So the idea of inwardness is one of these ideas. I just wanted to mention it. It's very important, and we'll see in the first chapter very clearly, again and again, how this is the entire... The Alter Rebbe is lifting us from our, what's called in Yiddish, our tag täglichen Leben, our day-to-day life, and he's bringing us into a more true and a deeper reality. And of course, why is the Alter Rebbe doing this again? As mentioned now many times, he's doing this because we asked him to, right? In other words, our question was, how can I have an authentic relationship with God? How can I have love and fear and righteous speech and deed and thought all together, all as one authentic and consistent whole, right? Or a different way of saying this is, how is it all very close to me in my heart and in my mind to do it? And the answer is, the first thing you have to do is you have to be less superficial. We have to start looking at the true reality of things. If you really want the answer to that question, if you're really looking for God, you're not going to find him judging things superficially. Nowadays, in our current society, and I should note that this is not a across-the-board insult to our current society. On the contrary, since the Tanya's inception, really since Judaism's inception, the world, since the very beginning, since the Torah was given on Mount Sinai and maybe earlier, the world has always resisted and been difficult to reconcile with Judaism. which is a running theme of Judaism. Judaism, the world and the Torah are not reconciled one to another. In fact, that's maybe the Jews' job, is to get them to be at peace, right? To use the Torah to reconcile God with the world. That's why the Torah is compared to peace, right? Reconciliation. So every age had its challenges. The time of the Alter Rebbe, when the Alter Rebbe spoke the words that went into the Tanya and wrote the Tanya with his own hand, had its own challenges and its own advantages, and our time has its own challenges and its own advantages. And this is something I could speak about again for many, many classes, many, many hours. One of our challenges in our time is that, and in the true reckoning, the further we go into Tanya, I'm hoping the more we'll see that it's really not so bad, right? Every time's buried within the challenge of each generation is also the great redeeming quality of that generation. Our challenges reflect how the greatness when they're overcome, right? Or when we deal with them correctly. So the very thing that is so difficult for us, in fact, in a strange way and in an inner way, in a panemiistic way, as the Alter Rebbe would have us look at it, is actually, in fact, the great quality of our generation that makes us uniquely positioned to appreciate Chassidus. But at one level, at the simplest level, one of the challenges of our generation learning Chassidus is that we're very, very, very superficial. And when I say we're superficial, we're chitzoniistic, I don't mean, which is the external, the opposite of pnimius, chitzonius, right? Pnim meaning the inside in Hebrew, chitzonius literally meaning the outside, the inner and the outer. So you have, when I say we're superficial, we're external. I don't just mean like, everyone's an airhead watching the Kardashians, although that's also true. That's not what I mean by saying that we're superficial. What I mean when I say we're superficial is that every single living human being has experiences both of the inner reality and the outer reality. Every single human being has experiences of the pnimius and the chitzonius, of the inner and the outer. Every person has an inner life. They have a irreducible, subjective self that is the core of their being. And that being has all sorts of experiences and emotions and thoughts. And that being has a whole reality of its own. It has a whole world, an inner world in which it lives that no one else will ever know. The vast majority of our experiences and what it is to be us is private and unknowable by another. That's how we know that it's what makes us us, right? If someone else shared my own private subjectivity, they would just be me. That's what it means to be me. To be me means I have my own private inner reality, right? Then we have something, and I'm simplifying this to a massive degree, but there's something called the external, shared reality, right? What some might call, again, the objective reality, right? How things look from the outside. For example, when I look at everyone in this class, I see them from the outside. And even when I speak to them and really get to know them and know them my whole life, I still only know them really, in a sense, from the outside. Most of what they are remains hidden. Most of their inner world is concealed from me. And the greatness, one of the great things about the great artists, and one of the reasons that art exists, is because they're able to turn themselves inside out, right? They can take their inner reality and somehow, almost through, perhaps ultimately not in a rationally explicable way, maybe, right? Depending which art you're talking about, they're able to turn that reality inside out. They're able to remove the gross objective exterior and give you a taste and disappear, and you can truly be one and unite in an inner experience, right? It's the same not just in art, of course, it's the same in Lahavdil, in Torah, in teaching someone something with a teacher and a student. In most inner relationships, inner and profound and authentic relationships, you have similar experiences could be made. My mind went to art first, I suppose, because the whole idea of art, as the Rebbe explained in his letters, is that they're able to take the gross coarseness and refine it and find the inner reality in all superficial things in a way that not everyone in every field has that ability, right? When you have two people in a relationship, that's very different than an artist being able to use a medium, an actual physical medium, to convey his inner reality, whatever. That's all a footnote. So everybody has an experience of an inner and an outer reality. The question is, they're both very, very different one from the other. Now, today, more so than ever, we could have 5 classes just on the development of people's thought about these things and how nowadays we've come to a certain understanding that maybe would have been very different than that of 2,000 years ago. If you went to someone 2,000 years ago and had a conversation with them, they may think about this very differently. Nowadays especially, there's a huge difference between the inner reality and the outer reality. And most people have not even made the choice. Most people have had the choice made for them in their education and in the way they're raised and the way they're taught to look at the world, that the outer reality is the baseline reality. The outer reality is what's really real. And the inner reality reduces to the outer reality. In other words, what is your inner private self? What is your inner reality? It is a very unusual cul-de-sac, or what's the word? Like a distant relative, like a far branch on the tree of external reality. External reality is what's really real. Your inner reality, in a way that, by the way, has not been explained yet, and between you and me will never ever be explained, but that's the supposed goal, that the inner reality is meant to be explicable in terms of the outer reality. And in fact, Team Outer Reality says outer reality is all there is. And that is the team that most people are on, not because they were given a real choice, but because that's how we're educated and how we're raised. The real reality is the outer reality. When a person is talking about their feelings, that's subjective. That's not really real, right? Real is how much money did they pay me, for example, right? Or even more real, does my hand go through it? That's really real. That's tangible. That's gross, coarse materiality, right? And Chassidus, the lowest of all things, right? More or less. So when we come to learning Tanya, we're being asked to exercise muscles that we have, and in fact, especially when it comes to the godly soul, that are extremely robust and always in shape, non-deteriorating. But nevertheless, in our animal soul, in our conscious experience, you could say, we're being asked to stretch muscles that we don't normally use. Many of us are not used to thinking of the world in terms of the inner reality. Chassidus is on the side of the inner reality. Chassidus says the exact opposite, in fact. Just as the way we're taught to think says the inner reality reduces to the outer reality, and outer reality is really all there is, Chassidus says the exact opposite. Chassidus says the inner reality is all there is. The outer reality is not really real. The outer reality is outer for a reason, Chassidus would say. There's much more to be said on this subject, but I thought it would be important just to touch on this before we start learning Tanya. We have to, and the Alter Rebbe is going to be demanding this of us, and the way the Alter Rebbe says it is in much more subtle ways than the way I'm saying it now. I'm saying it very clear, right? The Alter Rebbe, it's going to be mostly implicit, right? We're going to work in our class to unpack what it is that the Alter Rebbe is saying. But I want to point out that the first chapter of Tanya, which really addresses the most basic question a person can ask, which is, who am I? The most basic question. Even to acknowledge that that's the most basic question, by the way, is to live in the inner reality. Right? By the way, if you haven't noticed, right? This leads me to a third prefatory remark. None of these were in my notes, by the way. I'm well on a rant. L'chaim. This leads to the third prefatory remark. person could pick up Tanya and say something that's going to sound very silly to you, but there's versions of this that are not so silly. They would say, for a book that's meant to be about connecting to God, the Tanya sure starts on a narcissistic note. The Tanya starts immediately talking about you. Now, of course, we already know in this class that the second part of Tanya was at some point the first part of Tanya, and the second part of Tanya talks about us almost not at all, right? The second part of Tanya is all about God, and we are barely in the book at all. But at the end of the day, the Alter Rebbe made that the second part, not the first part. The first part of Tanya, the canonical first chapter of Tanya, starts talking about me, myself. And not myself as a transcendent piece of God above, which is chapter 2. That's the other self. How we can call them both selves is something I'm still trying to figure out. I guess I have until we get to that chapter to figure it out, to stretch out chapter 1. But the other self, the regular animal self, is what we start talking about in chapter 1, right? The same old guy is what we're talking about in the first chapter of Tanya. I want to point out to you that the reason we're talking about ourselves so much, and there's a famous Hasidic story, I told it a few weeks ago at the Farbrengen on Shabbos, which means no one remembers, so I'll tell it again. There's a famous Hasidic story that a certain, I forget who it was, I forget if there's a name in the story even, I don't think it was described to the Baal Shem Tov. I can't remember. Someone, either a Chassid or a Rebbe, I apologize for not remembering which, in the very early days of Chassidus, in the times of the powerful opposition to Chassidus, stayed in a town that was very Chassidically challenged, a Chassidically challenged community, we say in the politically correct sense. And when he left, and he was, he had to sit through and keep himself quiet as they mocked and of course, they made it very difficult for him when he was staying there. When he left, they said, what do you make of the difference between your Yiddishkeit and our Yiddishkeit, your Judaism and our Judaism? And the Chassid said to them, the difference between your Judaism and my Judaism is that you think about God all day, I think about myself all day. And with this, they're very impressed. They said, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The Chassidim are all totally self-centered. All they talk about is them and their soul and themselves. And us, we think about God all day. But of course, the Chassid explained what he meant, which is that by you and your Judaism, you spend all day, does God exist? Is there a God? What will God give me if I do this? What will God give me if I do that? All day they're thinking about God. Whereas the Chassid, he thinks about himself all day. The question is, do I even exist? How can God tolerate an existence such as I? What does it even mean for me to be here in this world? That's the way a Chassid thinks about himself all day. Yes. It may be one that you were not. The Tanya talks about the self because Tanya is inner, not because Tanya is egotistical. In other words, there's another famous story. I'll tell you another famous story in the same vein, that there were, it's not really about this point, but it's cute. I'll say it's cutely connected. There were certain Chassidim who were visiting the Rebbe Maharash, the Alter Rebbe's great-grandson, when he was Rebbe. And they noted that he davened for a very long time, which is the Chabad way. The Chabad way, ideally, is to daven at length, right? Not in a fake way, but in a very real way, with proper preparation, and then slow and considered and contemplative davening. So they told the Rebbe Maharash, they were surprised. They said that by our Hasidic group, we daven much faster. The Rebbe Maharash said, why do you daven much faster? They said, because if you're in a carriage that's going through a village full of bandits. You're going through a bandit camp in your carriage. You don't slow down the carriage, right, so that the bandits can all jump on. You have to speed up, right? Davening is fast. If we tarry here too much, if we spend too much time here, all sorts of things can come and get us. So we have to go fast and go through. Marash says, you see, that's the difference. Because my carriage, the ruffians are already on. They're already inside. I have to stop it and kick them out. That's why it takes me so long, right? It's not really the point that I'm trying to bring out in our class exactly, but the connection is as follows. The connection is that the egocentricity of Chassidus, the fact that Chassidus addresses the inner life, is sometimes mistaken for egocentricity. People who have trouble with thinking in an inner way, in what I dare say is a mystical way, although that word is a dangerous word, although I'll probably end up using it 1,000 more times anyway, until I find a better one. People who have trouble thinking in an inner way think that Chassidus is raising issues that they don't have anyway. That's really the problem, right? This is why Tanya is made for people that have questions, right? Aside from, of course, what we said in our very first class, which is that we know that studying Tanya helps the person get the right question, so we study it anyway, regardless. But in the simplest level, right, some people think, you will encounter this all the time, and you may encounter it from the greatest opposition to Chassidus, which is your own animal soul and Yetzer Hara. They might say that Chassidus is so bringing up issues that are so arcane and so subtle, and it's not like my issue. Not in the sense that it's like intellectually abstract, but in the sense that why can't I just live my day-to-day life? Why can't I just go about my business? Is it really so bad? Like, why do I have to worry about this? And who am I, right? People who are men of action have trouble with all of this. I'm sitting around staring at my own belly button asking, who am I and what am I for? That's one type of person, but not everybody is that type of person. Not everybody is a contemplative. Not everybody is necessarily coming to Tanya as a philosophical type of person that sees benefit in sitting around and asking, who am I? And really asking the question, right? So when Chassidus comes and raises these questions, they think that Chassidus is being more self-centered than them just living their life of action, so to speak, at peace, comfortable, right? To which the answer, of course, is that to not have the inner dimension is much worse than having questions you're struggling with in the inner dimension, right? In other words, dead people also aren't suffering. Yes, as the Hasidim would say many times, there's many ways to say it in Chassidus, because you hear it at Fabrengens all the time, right? If you're dead, you're not suffering. Right? So when Chassidus comes and makes you suffer, don't complain because it's asking all these questions and looking at you and it's making you feel like you're being egotistical because you're thinking about yourself, God forbid. It's the exact opposite. The discomfort is a sign of life. The fact that you actually are thinking about yourself and are devoting time to yourself, this is an escape from what was a much worse situation when you were so happy and just gliding merrily along in your day-to-day life and just sort of going through the motions, never asking questions, never thinking about yourself, right? So this is the third thing I wanted to say. The first thing I wanted to say, Chassidus is focused on Pnimius. Chassidus is focused on the inner reality, and this is a theme of the whole first chapter of Tanya. The second thing I wanted to say is that nowadays these are muscles we don't often flex. We are not in our society given the tools, given an education where the inner reality is put even on the same footing as the external objective reality of the world. And in fact, never mind what Chassidus says, which is that the inner reality is the true reality and everything else is not really real. The third point that I've just made was, the third point that I wanted to make before we start the first chapter, was that just because Chassidus is telling you to look at yourself does not mean that that turn towards looking at yourself makes you have more of an ego problem than you did before you started looking at yourself. In fact, the exact opposite is true. The exact opposite is true. When the turn to looking at yourself is a turn away, in the eyes of Chassidus, from the external, objective reality, which is really lowliness and separation and death in the eyes of Chassidus, quite literally in some discourses. And you're turning towards the inner true reality of things, which is the inner soul reality. And just because you're now turning into the inner soul reality, don't let any opponent of Chassidus, especially the worst one that's in your own heart, tell you that this is all a waste of time and this is all navel gazing, right? Staring at your own belly button when you could be doing something more useful. On the contrary, you can't be doing anything more useful. This is an important question. Okay. So, we've come to the Alter Rebbe. We've asked him, please help me find godliness, please help me connect to Hashem. How do I have love and fear of God in an authentic way in my life? The Alter Rebbe spent the introduction explaining to you that really a book can't help you with this, but I can, and the Tanya is me, so don't worry about it. It's not a book. It's the Alter Rebbe written down and given over. And now, chapter 1, first things first. Yeah, let's start learning, let's start reading chapter 1. Perek Aleph, chapter 1. Yes, there's more Tanyas if people want Svarim. Yes, there is. Is there another one? Yes. Volume 1, right there. All right. Where were we? Perek Aleph, chapter 1. Tanya b'seif Perek Gimel Nida. It's taught in a brisa at the end of the third chapter of Nida. Before we get to what's taught, we have to first deal with these three words, which I assure you, there's quite a lot written about these three words themselves. First of all, Tanya. Those who attend Rabbi Shmuli's Gemara Shir on Tuesday, much highly recommended, will know that Tanya means it's taught in a Tanaitic source. That's how I learned it when I was in high school, in rabbinic literature. So you have the Mishnah. The Talmud, of course, here's the crash course. We'll do it on one foot, right? The Talmud, of course, is comprised of two different books that are put together. You have the Mishnah, which is from the generation of compiled by Rav Yehuda Hanasi, around the times just relatively closer to the destruction of the Second Temple. And you have the sages of that generation, who are called the Tanaim, the teachers of the Mishnah's generation. And then you have the Gemara, which comments on the Mishnah, which is a commentary, is a bit of, what's it called? A commentary is an understatement. It's called a commentary, but technically you could say that the Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. It takes with very terse teachings from the Tanaim and then expounds upon it for centuries later, compiled by Ravina and Rav Ashi in verdant Babylon, in Aramaic, and that comments on the sages of the earlier generation, right? So Tanya, when you see in the Talmud Tanya, which is, I don't know, must be in the Talmud thousands and thousands of times, it means we learned in a Tanaitic source that's not in the Mishnah. That's really what it means. It's a brisa, which means an extra Mishnaic Tanaitic source. Because all of those words are not really English words, so I don't know if that helps anyone. But it's like phylacteries, exactly. Words that only Jews know. Tabernacle, leaven. The rabbis of the generation of the Mishnah taught, but not in a Mishnah, in a different teaching that had been passed down, that they had received teacher to student from the days of the Mishnah. These teachings are brought to flesh out and expand on the Mishnah, and also usually often to ask questions and to compare and contrast with the Mishnah and try and make sense of it all the time in the Talmud. Very, very common. So, the Tanya, the book, the Tanya, why is it called the Tanya? Because remember, when we read the title page, we said it was the Kutei Amarim, compiled sayings, and we also said Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the intermediate man. But of course, what does everyone call it? And this, of course, this is by no accident, by Hashgacha Pratis. What is Tanya called? By divine providence, we call the book Tanya. Why is it called Tanya? Because the first word of the book is Tanya. I have news for you. There's many other Svarim whose first word is Tanya that are not called Tanya. Only this one is called Tanya. It's taught in a brisa, right? The wondrous thing about the Tanya that opens the Tanya is that if you open a Gemara to where it says the end of Nida, page 30b, I got it, thank you. Page 30b, at the end of Nida, if you open the Talmud, if you take a modern Talmud and a Gemara and you open it up, you will not find this there. It does not say this teaching. It's going to say as a Tanya, as it's taught in a Brisa. And the commentaries on Tanya, many of which I read, have an absolute field day. There's so much. It's so rich, right? It's what it says there. The teaching that we're going to learn. It says Darash Rabbi Simloi. Rabbi Simloi expounded, not in the language of Tanya, of a Tannaitic source. Compounding the confusion is that Rav Simloi was an Amira, not a Tana. Rav Simloi was not from the generation of the Mishnah, he was from the generation of the Talmud, right? Centuries later. And throughout the whole Talmud, you will see he's not treated as a Mishnaic sage. He's treated as a sage of the times of the Talmud, right? And nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe says Tanya. So there's many explanations. First of all, there are other places where the Gemara seems to ascribe Tannaitic teachings to Rav Simloi. Now, that's complicated because some commentaries on the Gemara say that this is an error, right? But on the other hand, because it's in more than one place, I think there's 2 or 3, so some would say that that's much more than could be a simple copying error, and maybe maybe we say that there's 2 Rav Simlois, which is very possible because there's many sages in the Talmud and the Gemara who are in both generations, and there's multiple of them who could not possibly have been one person. This close student of the Talmud will find out, because some were the students of people who were only the other ones students, right? If you work the whole tree together, as many have, and as students of the Talmud do, and put together the whole map of the teachings of the Talmud, you'll see that there's some sages where there's like 4 or 5 of them even that have the same name, which is not so surprising, right? Common Hebrew name. So they're not necessarily the same person. Others want to say that Rav Simloi was an Amira, but he quoted most often Tannaitic teachers. So sometimes Tannaitic teachings are ascribed to him, right? Yet a third party wants to say that sometimes there are some Amoraim who were very early Amoraim in the earliest generation, right after the redaction of the Mishnah, and sometimes the Talmud treats them as a Tana. And a famous Rav Tana of Polig, right? There's a famous saying in the Gemara that there are some rabbis who are considered like a Tana, and therefore the Talmud would treat them like a Tana, even if technically they weren't. However you want to explain this, none of this gets to the core issue really, which is, nevertheless, why did the Alter Rebbe start the book Tanya if he could have started it Darash? And then everyone would have called the book Darash. We wouldn't be having a Tanya class, we'd be having a Darash class. One assumes. This is not by accident. The Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the grandson of the Alter Rebbe, gives inner explanations from the inner Torah, from Kabbalah, for the reason that the Alter Rebbe decided to call the Sefer Tanya, even though the Talmud says Darash Rabbi Simloi. And there's basically 2 reasons. The 2 reasons are as follows, and I think that the two are, I assume, connected with one another. I think that there are actually 2 that are something like one, but there's 2. There's 2 explanations. One is that Tanya is Osias Esan. The word Tanya has the same letters as the word Esan. Esan or Etan in modern Hebrew, like the name Etan. Etan means strength. And the whole idea of the Tanya is it's referring to and calling forth the Esan Shebenefesh of the Jew. It's calling forth the strength and the inner strength of the Jew. The Tzemach Tzedek says it's like the Am Kshei Eref L'Mal Yusa. It's the stiff-necked quality of the Jew in the positive sense of that term, right? Meaning not stubbornness, but the hard reality of the Jew's connection to God, the strong, old, hard connection of the Jew to God that's deep within the soul that we're going to learn about as we go through Tanya, starting chapter 2. This is what the Alter Rebbe is calling out when we learn the Tanya, right? This is connected to what we mentioned earlier in our class, that studying the Tanya helps you have the right questions, we mentioned in the previous classes, right? This is part of the reason why, because the Alter Rebbe, even from the first word, is calling out to, right? With the word Tanya, the very word Tanya calls out the Esan Shebenefesh. It calls the strength of the soul, the inner connection of the Jew with God is being called and invoked from the very first word of the Sefer. That's one answer of the Tzemach Tzedek. The second answer of the Tzemach Tzedek, which is an answer that actually goes back to, if I recall correctly, to commentaries on the Zohar, which the Tzemach Tzedek says apply to this Sefer as well, is that there is a certain klippa, there's a certain negative energy or negative force that's named Tanya. And this is a negative force that tries to prevent the Jew from learning the inner secrets of Torah. Because if the Jew learns the inner secrets of Torah, this negative force is destroyed or hurt by learning this aspect of the Torah. So the Alter Rebbe put it as the first word of the Tanya, says the Tzemach Tzedek, and it's the first word of the Idra in Zohar. I'm not sure which Idra. There's two Idras, right, in Zohar. The first word of the Idra may be both. I don't know the Zohar so well, unfortunately, but the Idra, at least one of the Idras, also starts with the word Tanya. So the commentaries on the Zohar explain that the reason Rav Shimon Bar Yochai started the Idra with the word Tanya is because the Tanya, the very word Tanya, is the name of this oppositional force, which saying its name is part of removing it, tearing it away. So it's like a gateway. The word Tanya is like an entryway into studying the inner aspects of the Torah. This is the Tzemach Tzedek's explanation. So just in case you thought that the first word of the Tanya and the name of the Tanya is taken lightly, right? We can learn from this to every other word of the Tanya, which the Rebbeim and especially our Rebbe took in the most literal sense, that every single word and every letter of the Tanya is absolutely rich and full and stuffed full of meaning and significance. The first word, no less. The first word of Tanya was chosen very deliberately. I have to add just one more thing on the word Tanya. I saw this teaching from Rav Wolfson, who has many svarim, including on Chassidus. Rav Wolfson is the Rosh Hashiva or the Mashgiach of Torah V'das? I can't remember, but he wrote something very beautiful about the Tanya that I thought it would be nice to mention. I don't know what his source is or if this is his original idea, but I thought it was so beautiful when I saw it that I have to share it with you, which is that, I'd never heard this before except from him, that another reason that you could say the Sefer is called Tanya is that if you notice something about the letters Tanya, all four of these letters are the four letters that you use to conjugate words in Hebrew in the future tense, right? Taf is used to say you will do something. Yud, they will do something in the third person. Right? Nun, we will do something. And Aleph, I will do something. So all the future tense words are with the letters Taf, Nun, Yud, Aleph, the letters of the word Tanya. And of course, what's the whole theme of the Tanya? The theme of the Tanya is self-transformation. Right? It's all about opening up a new future for the person's self. So the whole word Tanya is in the future tense, which I thought was a sweet Torah to share with you. That's like I don't know. That's like a candy I thought I'd toss into the shir just for you. Yeah, it is. That's what's sweet about it. Okay. Tanya v'Seif Perek Gimel de Nida. It's taught at the end of the third chapter of Tractate Nida. Mashbiyim Osei, they make it take an oath. An oath is administered to him. To the soul before it's born, is what it's talking about in the Gemara. What is the oath? Tehi tzaddik, be righteous, v'al tehi rasha, and don't be wicked. V'afilu kol ha'olam kulo emrim lecha tzaddik, even if the entire world tells you are righteous, ata haya beinecha karasha, you should be wicked in your own eyes. This is the Braisa, this is the teaching of the sages that opens the book of Tanya. I'll read it again. Mashbiyim Eisei, they administer an oath to the soul before it's born. Ti tzaddik, be righteous, v'al rasha, and do not be wicked. V'afilu kol ha'olam kula emrim l'cha tzaddik, even if the entire world tells you you are righteous, ata haya b'einecha karasha, you must be in your own eyes as if you are wicked. You must regard yourself as if you were wicked in your own eyes.
Is the comma to be after tzaddik or after ata?
Say again?
The comma, is it after tzaddik or after ata?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Good question. Good point. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's after ata. Right? Yeah, but in translation, it's very hard to get the commas right in translation regardless. It's a very good point. I'm not sure. I don't know. I assumed it was after tzaddik, but maybe it's after ata. The entire world tells you you are a tzaddik, right? Or the entire world tells you you're a tzaddik, you should be in your eyes like a rasha. Yeah, I don't know. One question we can ask on this brisa. The Alter Rebbe is going to ask two questions. There's one other question that the Alter Rebbe asks, but not here, which I'll get to in a second. And then there is what the questions are really bringing out and pointing to in this statement. So first things first. First things first. One question that's asked on this bride. So let's do three questions. Maybe two. Okay, first of all, they make the soul take an oath. They administer an oath to the soul, and they tell it to be righteous and not to be wicked. The question of someone who's learned Tanya already is immediately to ask, which soul? Right? That's the first question that you ask. They administer an oath to a soul. As we're going to learn, the Jew has two souls, right? At least. If we don't want to make it even more complicated, he has at least two souls. So when they say they administer an oath to be righteous and not to be wicked, we have to ask, what situation are we talking about? It's before the birth of the soul. This is clear in the Gemara. The question is, which soul? And as the Alter Rebbe, it's going to come out later. We're going to see later in Tanya that this is actually talking about the godly soul. This is talking about the godly soul. Even though you would think, right, there's reasons to think both. It's actually a very strange idea that the soul is administered an oath, because if it's the godly soul, it doesn't need one, as we're going to see. A godly soul doesn't need to make promises that it'll be good, because it can't be anything other than good. And on the other hand, the animal soul, it's not clear why administering it an oath really helps if it doesn't remember the oath after it's born, etc. Right?
Is the animal soul even in existence before the person is born?
I would think it's a very good question. I would actually think there's far to say the opposite, because the godly soul only comes in by the bris and then by bar mitzvah.
No, but the godly soul is an existence that exists before the
Yes.
body is created.
Yes.
But the animal soul is created with the body.
Right.
Meaning there's no existence of the animal. It's not like the animal soul is existing separately
Yeah.
and then added to the body.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's created with the body, but it could be administered before the body is born.
Yeah, perhaps as a vlad, you could say, as a fetus, or as the fetus is being formed. Maybe you could say. I'm telling you what the hava mina is, right? That I saw anyway. So the question is which one is it talking about? Although that's a very good point. That's a very good point, and not something that I understand very well, by the way, in terms of what existence, if any, does the animal soul have apart from the guf or before the guf? I don't know, but it makes sense that it's created with the body, as you're saying. That makes sense to me. So the question is, if it's the godly soul, why would you need an oath? And if it is somehow the animal soul at some stage, it's not clear why this oath, what's the significance of this oath before birth, because it doesn't seem to be something that the animal soul remembers. Let's put it that way. So the answer is that it's the answer is that it's actually the godly soul, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain. We're going to see later that there's different ways, and also, of course, there's the famous Hasidic teaching that the oath doesn't just mean taking an oath. You could also read it as masbiyan oiseh, which is the famous teaching of the Tzemach Tzedek, that it's not just that an oath is administered to the soul, but that the soul is satisfied and given the power to the oath is really an act of fortification to the godly soul, that it should be able to carry out its duties even with the challenges that lie ahead when it comes into the body. And really that's what's being discussed here. What's being discussed here is this is an oath to the godly soul, not an oath because there's concern that the godly soul will not and will have any other desire. It's rather an oath that gives the godly soul strength to go forth and do battle, as we're going to discuss later in Tanya, with the animal soul and with the world, with the animal soul, the body, and the world. Right? So that's really the nature of this oath. This is actually an oath administered to the godly soul. You're going to go down there, you're going to go into battle. If we're not clear on what the godly soul and the animal soul are, by the way, this isn't something to really worry about now. I'm just trying to make this point about who is the oath given to. It's to the godly soul, and the godly soul is being entreated, be righteous, don't be wicked, and even if everyone tells you that you're righteous, you should be in your own eyes as wicked. And this is meant to give strength to the godly soul as it goes into the world, in one way or another. That's the first point. The second question, which the Alter Rebbe will be addressing later in Tanya, as we get into the answers to this question, which are only at least 12 chapters away in the Tanya, we begin to answer some of these questions. Another question is, what is the language of this brisa? What is the language that it says here? Be righteous and don't be wicked, which is a fascinating statement if you think about it, because these are two things which appear to be totally mutually exclusive, right? Why not, if you tell someone be righteous, don't be wicked, seems to be automatic. If I tell you be warm, right, you understand that you won't be cold. It's automatic. Aren't these two things like mutually exclusive? Aren't these two things antithetical to one another? Nevertheless, the soul is told, be righteous and don't be wicked, which seems to introduce, and as we will see as we go forward, does in fact introduce the idea that there is more to being righteous
All
than...
right, but first you'll have to unlock your device.
That's a new one. There's more to being righteous than merely not being wicked.
If I was telling you to be righteous, you have to unlock your neshama.
To unlock your neshama. Like your phone. I gotcha.
The key is in here.
The Siri wanted to join into, or whatever the Google version of Siri is, wanted to join in.
Free.
This is it's like outside of the human race.
Listen, it's coming. Better prepare yourself, right? So there's more to being a tzaddik than just not being a rasha. Which brings us to the next point, which is that even in the brisa that the Alter Rebbe chooses to open the chapter with, you see the idea of pnimius. You see that this whole chapter is about inner realities, right? You can't even read the brisa with a superficial understanding of righteousness and wickedness. If righteousness and wickedness simply mean what we take them to mean in fairy tales, right? What we take them to mean in children's stories, right? Then it would be totally impossible to have both at the same time. Right? How could a person be not wicked and not be righteous? Or how could a person be righteous and also be wicked? Right? However you want to frame it. And yet, this brisa seems to imply that you need both. You need, number one, to be righteous, and number two, to not be wicked. What does that point to? It points to that these are not descriptions of technical state of affairs. It's not like being warm and being cold. Right? Where you can either be one or the other, and if you're one, you're not the other, right? There is something more inner and more profound that is being discussed here. which leads immediately, if the student picks up on this sense, that there's immediately introduced in the first brisa a distinction between being a tzaddik and not being a rasha, that leads immediately into the questions that the Alter Rebbe asks, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is saying, he opens the Tanya, and he says, we learn in the Talmud that the soul is told three things: be righteous, don't be wicked, which is a separate thing that it needs to be told, and even if the whole world tells you to be righteous, you in your eyes have to be like you're wicked, which itself, this is the third part of the statement, which is the one that the Alter Rebbe is going to ask his immediate questions on. This is the one that the last part where it says, even if the whole world tells you to be righteous, you have to consider yourself in your own eyes as wicked. That's what the Alter Rebbe immediately asks his questions on. And before we even get to the Alter Rebbe's questions, because sometimes my problem when I learn Tanya is that I read too fast. I don't stop. Sorry? I don't, exactly. Where's the fire? I don't have to, I think I like to force myself to stop and actually think about for some time, to give my mind time to seize upon the close shut around the actual thing that's being discussed. This is a very bizarre brisa. You have the first part, which is be righteous and don't be wicked, which we've explained that part. And the second part is bizarre, right? The Torah of truth, the Torah of honesty, right, is telling the person what you are and how you have to see yourself, right, are actually two different things, right? There's two different things. Promise me you'll be righteous. So let's say that the promise is fulfilled and the person is righteous. Nevertheless, says the Talmud, even when you fulfill your promise, don't view yourself as what you are, right? View yourself as something else. It's a very bizarre statement if you think about it, right? The Tanya in our very first brisa, the quote from the Gemara, the Alter Rebbe chooses to open the Tanya with, is a quote that seems to be encouraging. The harsh way of saying it is a quote that seems to be encouraging deception at some way, or I don't know if dishonesty is the right word, but I think the better way, or a more positive way, or a more nuanced way of reading it is that the Alter Rebbe is already introducing, this is very layered. There's at least two aspects to the person. In fact, there's really, if I think about it, there's three, right? There's what the person is, which either they're fulfilling their oath or they're not. So either they're a tzaddik or a rasha. Even that there's a question, right? Because there's a tzaddik and then there's a non-rasha, a rasha, and a tzaddik at least, right? Which is interesting. But so let's say they're fulfilling their oath. So then there's tzaddik, and that's what the Torah is giving you an oath to be. And now there's another layer, which is the whole world recognizes you as righteous. So there's what you promised you would be, and let's say you're fulfilling it. Then there's the whole world telling you what you are, which could be in consonance with what you are. It's not that they're mistaken. They're telling you are what you are. They're telling you you're a tzaddik, and you are a tzaddik. But then there's the third thing, which is how you're supposed to view yourself, which is as a rasha, which is as the opposite of what you are. It's very bizarre. What is this? I'm not sure what this Gemara means. In other words, even at the simple level, it's not so clear to me, right? I think at the simple level, this is moral meant to be like moral guidance, right? In other words, don't get too haughty or too overconfident, right? You're supposed to always view yourself as wicked. But because we are looking at it with the eyes of Pnimius, right? And because we realize this is not a question, as is going to become very, very clear, because the Alter Rebbe is going to demonstrate it beyond a doubt, that what we're talking about is not externalities. It's not behavior. What we're talking about is what you are, which makes the question so much stronger, right? Because if it's about not getting overconfident, right, that could make sense if my righteousness is an act that I've put on, or like a garment that I wear, right? So I'm acting righteous now, and people say, oh, what a tzaddik, because you do I put $100 in the tzedakah box and everyone saw. So everyone's saying, oh, what a tzaddik. And the Gemara tells you, no, even when they tell you you're a tzaddik, you should look at yourself as wicked. You should know you're not so great. But that's not what's going on here, right? On the contrary, I made a promise I would be righteous. And I actually am righteous. Not it's something that I do, right? Tehi tzaddik. It doesn't say do acts of righteousness. It says be a tzaddik. So I fulfill my oath and I am a tzaddik. Why should I even care what the world tells me? First of all, why should I care if the world tells me I'm righteous? Second of all, if what they say is true, then it's true. What's this whole act of self-deception where I'm now supposed to tell myself I'm actually wicked? On the contrary, I'm actually righteous. So what does telling myself I'm wicked actually gain me at all if I'm actually righteous? Right? The whole brisa, it's a one-line brisa, but really it's very difficult to appreciate what this brisa is saying, especially if you view it through the eyes of Pnimius, which, as we've already said, is the Alter Rebbe's whole goal here. If you read Tehi Tzadik, Tehi Rasha, Al Tehi Rasha, be righteous and don't be wicked, as actually talking about the true inner reality of the person, what you be, not what you do, then it becomes a very difficult brisa to understand. The Alter Rebbe asks two questions. He asks two questions here. The question about be righteous and don't be wicked is also asked, but not here. It's asked later in the Tanya. And now the Alter Rebbe asks two questions right here in the Tanya. V'tzarich lahavin, we need to understand. I should point out to you, I think I've pointed it out in this class like at least 3 times before in other Maimarim. We'll point it out again, that when Chassidus asks questions, right, on texts, on teachings of the sages, we never say it's not understood. We say, tzarich lahavin, we need to understand, because our whole approach, of course, is one of humility. It's not that it doesn't make sense, it's that we need to understand. As I found out very quickly when in one of my first days in Hasidic Yeshiva, I was attending a certain Gemara shir by a rabbi who will remain nameless, even though it's really to his merit, this whole thing, not to his detriment. But there's a certain rabbi in this yeshiva where I first attended in my very first days in Hasidic Yeshiva, where someone told him in Gemara class that the Talmud that we're learning doesn't make sense. And then we got the half-hour speech that every class would get when they would come in, which is the half-hour diatribe that no one has ever forgotten about how maybe the Gemara makes sense, and it's just your stupid small brain that cannot wrap itself around the greatness of the Gemara. And frankly, if we were here to talk about what you think, we can close all the books, go grab a cigarette, and we can talk about what you think. But since we're here in the Talmud class, maybe you shouldn't be saying what doesn't make sense. Maybe you should be saying you don't understand, so we can keep the books open and actually learn what someone who has something worth studying has to say. Something like along those lines. What? No, it's not verbatim. It's paraphrased, but that was the gist. That was the gist of the. It was longer and much more practiced. He gave the same speech all the time. He would wait for that one student. He would wait for that one student who would say the magic words that the Talmud doesn't make sense, and it was good. It was a learning moment. That's a real teacher. And it's to his tremendous merit because he's absolutely right, first of all. And second, clearly he had a way of doing it that people didn't forget. Right? I remember. So it was unforgettable. So in Chassidus, when we ask questions on the sayings of our holy sages, the quotes from the holy Talmud, we say tzarich lahavin. We say we need to understand. Our questions are not a form of it not making sense, they are a form of us not appreciating it. The Frierdiker Rebbe says in Sichos, there's a talk of the previous Rebbe of Lubavitch where he explains why Chassidim, this is really going to be a paraphrase, I'm probably going to mess it all up, but he says why Chassidim don't write as many Sfarim of Chidushei Torah, of Torah innovations, of their own Torah thoughts, as some of the Chassidically challenged. The short version is, and I'm probably ruining it, but in my paraphrase, the short version is that when someone who's Chassidically challenged learns a Sefer, they find a question on Rashi, and they see that Rashi is in great danger from this question, and they go on a 5-hour-long quest through all of the Talmud and all of these different books to rescue Rashi. And at the end of the day, they manage to rescue Rashi, and they write a whole memoir about their quest of how they managed to save Rashi from this question. He says, whereas a chassid, he learns the question on Rashi, and he says, I'm such an idiot. I don't understand what Rashi says. I don't understand what the question says. He spends 5 hours learning, and what does he find out? He finds out that, in fact, he was an idiot. He finds out that there's an answer to the question. It wasn't so terrible. And then, of course, he doesn't write a book commemorating how much of an idiot he was. Why would you write a book commemorating the fact that you were unable to appreciate Rashi after 5 hours of thinking about it, right? Or more, many more maybe. Anyway, Tzarich L'havin, we need to understand. Let's read the Alter Rebbe's 2 questions, then we'll finish. Tzarich L'havin, the Hatanan, it's taught in the Mishnah, Avos Perek Beis, the 2nd chapter of Pirkei Avos, V'al tirasha b'fnei atzmecha. Do not be wicked in your own eyes. This first question of the Alter Rebbe is a textual contradiction, right? There's another text, there's another teaching of the Mishnaic sages in the Mishnah, which says you should not be wicked in your own eyes. So how do you reconcile that with our Brisa, which says, even if everyone tells you you're wicked, you should be wicked in your own eyes? We'll discuss this question more next week. I'm just reading them now and we'll finish. We'll discuss these more next week. So the first question is textual. There seems to be a contradiction from a different Tanaitic teaching, which says almost literally the exact opposite, it would seem. V'gam, and furthermore, the second question of the Alter Rebbe, im yeh be'enecha karasha, if you will be, im yeh be'enav karasha, if he will be in his eyes like a wicked person, yura levavai, let's get the official translation. He will be grieved at heart. V'yeh atzav, and he will be sad. V'lo yuchol laved havaya b'simcha b'tuv levav, and he will not be able to serve God with joy and with a glad heart. V'imloi, and the other half of the second question is v'imloi yara levavei klal mizeh, but if he is not at all disturbed by how wicked he is, yachol lavi lidei kalus chas v'shalom, he could come to a state of lightness, which really, I believe, the correct translation is apathy. I believe is the correct translation here. He can come to, they translate irreverence. He translates here, okay, irreverence, not apathy. It's a different translation. A person could come to irreverence, right? A person could come to treat the Torah. Irreverence makes sense, literally treating the Torah lightly, right? The person could come to irreverence, God forbids. The first question of Alter Rebbe on the opening brisa of the Tanya is, there's a Mishnah which seems to say different. That's the first question. The second question is a question from Svara. It's a logical question. The logical question, not in other words, as opposed to textual. The first question is textual. The second question is Svara. It's a logical question. The question is that it seems that either way you have it, thinking that you're wicked is an issue, right? Because the person either is bothered by the fact that they're wicked, in which case they're not able to serve God with joy. We'll discuss all this more next week, God willing. Or, on the other hand, they're not bothered by the fact that they are wicked, which, by the way, in the implication of the Alter Rebbe's question, you see that the Alter Rebbe does not settle for the idea that he's only supposed to be calling himself wicked. The Alter Rebbe immediately realizes that if the Torah tells him to call himself wicked, he must actually be wicked. And if he actually is wicked, and he's not bothered by the fact that he's wicked, that leads to irreverence. And if he is bothered by the fact that he's wicked, that leads to sadness. Right? So it seems that if a person is wicked and looks at themselves as wicked, or doesn't, if a person is wicked, it seems like there's no way out. What does it help to either look at yourself or not look at yourself as wicked? If you look at yourself as wicked, it's only going to make you sad. You're not going to be able to serve God with joy, which itself is an interesting point from the Alter Rebbe and reflective of his whole worldview, as we'll discuss more next week. And on the other hand, if the person is wicked and is not bothered by it, right? In a sense, maybe that's even worse, because that means he's not bothered by it. He doesn't care, right? It doesn't. Why would that be the Torah's advice, right? To not be, as it says in the Mishnah, right? That's the advice of the other text. The other text says a person should not view themselves as wicked. Well, if you actually are wicked and you don't view yourself as wicked, what's going to be? I thought the Torah was on team righteousness. It sounds like this is the Torah saying it's not on team righteousness. It sounds like the Torah is saying it's okay if you just don't care. You could read it, right? So these are the two questions of the Alter Rebbe. These questions themselves obviously require more explanation. God willing, next week we'll continue. We made it we read so much this week. Next week we'll have to read less. This was way too much in 1 week. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost 7 lines of the Tanya read this week. I don't want to overwhelm myself. All right, God willing, we continue next week. Thank you very much.